Hello and welcome to the Fault of Horror. And on today's episode of Worst to First, we're gonna get hammered. Hammer Films Productions was once known for its comedy, crime, and noir movies. But near the tail end of the Universal monster craze, Hammer reinvented themselves and emerged as the new horror juggernaut with reimagined versions of classic tales such as Dracula and Frankenstein. As the 1970s came to a close, the once prolific studio became passé and vanished into obscurity. That is until some 30 years later when the studio was revived. Since the late 2000s, Hammer has released 7 feature films. Today we'll be ranking all of them. Hammer also produced a web series called Beyond the Rave in 2008, which was the first of its revival productions, but given that it's not a feature film, we're not going to include it on the list today. And at dead last, number 7, is the sequel to The Woman in Black, called The Angel of Death. The Woman in Black is an entity out for vengeance due to the death of her own child. The second film is about a group of school children who seek refuge in an abandoned house during World War II. The woman can force children to commit suicide. The deaths fail to make much of an impact, which kind of deludes the suspense a little bit. And this is a largely forgettable movie, and probably the only one on the list that I don't really like that much. Number 6 is The Quiet Ones. It's set in 1974 and loosely based on the Philip experiment, conducted in Toronto in 1972, which was an attempt to create a fictional being and communicate with it through seance. It's not bad, but the scares are a little bit cheap and it's not nearly as interesting as the source material. It's ironic that films such as The Exorcist changed the landscape of horror and contributed to the untimely demise of Hammer, and some 40 years later, the revival of Hammer gives us this kind of uninspired knockoff of films like The Exorcist. They insist on constantly reminding you when this takes place by having the characters consistently listening to 70s classic rock. But other than that, the sound design is fantastic. The atmospheric sound enhances the mood with this sort of ambient noise and choir singing. Unfortunately, they also use some kind of shoddy CG at certain points, which really takes away from a few key moments of the film. Not terrible by any stretch, but it just fails to stand out among similar films. Number 5 is Wakewood, which was actually the first film on the list produced, but it was later picked up by Hammer and received a widespread release in 2011, which made it the second of the Hammer revival films. After a young girl is mauled to death by a dog, her parents move to a town called Wakewood. Soon after, they discover the townsfolk can perform a pagan ritual that will bring their child back to life, but only for 3 days. The sound design can be a little noisy and intense, and the plot feels a little bit too rapid. There's plenty of grotesque imagery, but this is actually a bit of a ripoff of Pet Sematary. It was produced in Ireland, which really gives it a distinct feel. Number 4 is the first Woman in Black film from 2012. This stars Daniel Radcliffe in his first role post Harry Potter, making it the film on our list that gained the most notoriety. Of the films on the list, this feels most like a throwback to the classic Hammer films. It has a lot of gothic imagery, it's very dark, and it sort of feels like it was designed after those old films. Unfortunately, the plot is a bit of a lazy setup. And frankly, it just kind of feels forced. And they do sort of resort to a lot of jump scares, but I've gotta say, they're good jump scares. And honestly, I'm just kind of okay with it. It has a nice chilling atmosphere, and this is the type of movie that you'll wanna watch with the lights turned down. Number 3 is the most recent film on our list, The Lodge from 2019. For a while there, Hammer seemed like it was dormant, and I thought perhaps this revival was going to be short-lived. So I was really thrilled when they dropped this trailer on us last year, and it looked phenomenal. The film, on the other hand, is a little bit uninspired, but that's not to say it's bad. It's definitely creepy. It starts off with a bang, literally. But the second act does move a little bit slowly. It's a very intimate setting with a limited cast. So this divorced man with 2 children plans to get remarried, and his kids aren't all that thrilled about it. So he decides to have a getaway to his lodge with his 2 children and his new fiance, in hopes that perhaps they will learn to get along with each other. And it turns out that his fiance has a pretty dark past that his children start to dig into a little bit. As it progresses, it gets increasingly. As it progresses. Okay, we should probably address the elephant in the room right now. If you've ever seen the film Hereditary, there's this involvement of a cult. They use these dolls of the family for foreshadowing. It seems like it's a bit of a knockoff of Hereditary, which is definitely a superior film, but that's not to say that The Lodge is a bad movie. I definitely enjoyed this one. Number 2 is The Resident, starring Hilary Swank and Jeffrey Dean Morgan. This also has Christopher Lee in a supporting role, which makes this the final Hammer film of his career. It takes the unique approach of revealing the assailant early on, which actually makes it more suspenseful. So this is a creepy but fun last hurrah for Christopher Lee and an all-around good movie. Very underrated. It kind of got panned by critics, and I don't think that's justified. They dared to be different, and in my opinion, it paid off. And that brings us to number 1, which is Let Me In from 2010, which is a remake of a Swedish film titled Let the Right One In, and both films are based off a book of the same name. I know this is a very unpopular opinion, but I prefer this remake over the original. It was the first of these Hammer revival films I saw. I was really excited they were making movies again, and I was actually unfamiliar with the original one prior to seeing this, and I think that is a large reason to why I prefer this remake over that original one. So it's the tragic story of this young girl who's a vampire, and she befriends this young boy, and that's not where the real terror is. It's actually in the way that this young boy gets bullied at school. So you would think the vampires would typically be the villains in a film, but this takes a very different approach, and instead we root for this vampire. So it's an unpopular opinion to say that this is better than the original. I think both have their strong suits, but I stand by my decision to put this at number 1 on the list. So that does it for today. That's all 7 of the Hammer revival films, and hopefully they've got plenty more in store for us in the future. Thanks for watching.